The gunshot echoed across the Oklahoma plains like thunder on a clear day. Ezra McKinnon dropped his morning coffee, the tin cup clattering against the wooden porch as he grabbed his Winchester and sprinted toward the sound. Black smoke billowed from behind the ridge where his neighbor's property began, and even from a quarter-mile away, he could smell the acrid stench of burning oil. By the time he reached the Morrison place, half the town was already there. What remained of old Pete Morrison's farmhouse was a smoldering skeleton against the dawn sky. The oil derrick that had been erected just 50 yards from Pete's front door the week before now stood like a guilty monument over the destruction, its metal frame twisted and blackened. Sheriff Tom Bradley was already on scene, his weathered face grim as he surveyed the wreckage. "Anyone seen Pete?" he called out to the gathering crowd. "He's alive," came a voice from behind the crowd. Dr. Sarah Henderson emerged from behind her buggy, her medical bag in hand and her dress stained with soot. "I've got him loaded up. Burns on his arms and some smoke in his lungs, but he'll live. Question is whether he'll have anything left to live for." Ezra pushed through the crowd to get a closer look at the destruction. The explosion had been so violent that pieces of Pete's roof were scattered across 3 acres. But what made his blood run cold was the sight of the oil-soaked earth beneath the wreckage. The ground was black as tar for 30 yards in every direction, and a sickly rainbow sheen covered what remained of Pete's well water. "Hell of a thing," said Sam Turner, appearing at Ezra's elbow. The old storekeeper's voice was tight with worry. "That's the 3rd accident this month. First the Collins place caught fire after they refused to sell. Then Mary Hutchinson's cattle started dying after that derrick went up next to her pasture. Now this." Ezra nodded grimly. He'd been thinking the same thing. The Castellanos Oil Company had moved into the territory 6 months ago like a plague of locusts, buying up land and drilling wherever they pleased. Those who sold made fortunes overnight. Those who refused to sell seemed to encounter an unusual run of bad luck. "McKinnon." Sheriff Bradley's voice cut through the morning air. "Need to talk to you." Ezra made his way over to where Bradley stood examining the base of the oil derrick. Up close, the damage looked even worse. The explosion had started here, that much was obvious. But something about the twisted metal didn't look right. "What do you make of this?" Bradley asked, pointing to a section of pipe that had been blown clean away from the main structure. Ezra knelt down and examined the metal. The edges were too clean, too uniform. "This wasn't an accident, Tom. Look at these cuts. Someone used dynamite, and they knew exactly where to place it." Bradley nodded slowly. "That's what I was thinking. Question is who, and why make it look like Pete's fault?" Before Ezra could answer, the sound of approaching hooves drew their attention. A sleek black carriage was making its way up the dirt road, pulled by 2 magnificent thoroughbreds that looked wildly out of place in the Oklahoma countryside. The driver was a Mexican man in an expensive suit, and beside him sat a woman whose very presence seemed to change the atmosphere around them. Victoria Castellanos stepped down from the carriage with the grace of someone accustomed to being watched. Her emerald green traveling dress was immaculate despite the dusty journey, and her dark hair was arranged in an elaborate style that spoke of money and breeding. But it was her eyes that caught Ezra's attention. They were the color of rich coffee, and they held an intelligence that made him immediately wary. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying a slight accent that somehow made everything she said sound more important. "I came as soon as I heard about the terrible accident. Is Mr. Morrison badly hurt?" Sheriff Bradley tipped his hat respectfully, but his tone remained professional. "He'll recover, Miss Castellanos. Though I'm afraid his property is a total loss." Victoria surveyed the destruction with what appeared to be genuine concern. "How dreadful. I do hope our company's insurance will be able to compensate him adequately for his losses." "Your company's insurance?" Ezra stepped forward, unable to keep the suspicion out of his voice. "Ma'am, this derrick was drilling on Morrison land without his permission. Far as I know, Pete never signed any agreements with Castellanos Oil." Victoria's eyes met his for the first time, and Ezra felt something pass between them. Not attraction exactly, though she was undeniably beautiful. It was more like recognition, the way two poker players might acknowledge each other across a crowded saloon. "I'm afraid there may have been some miscommunication," she said smoothly. "My understanding was that Mr. Morrison had agreed to lease the mineral rights. But regardless of any paperwork issues, my father's company takes full responsibility for what happened here." "Mighty generous of you," Bradley said, though his tone suggested he found her generosity suspect. "I don't suppose you'd know anything about how this derrick happened to explode?" Victoria's expression didn't change, but Ezra noticed her hands tighten almost imperceptibly on her gloves. "Sheriff, I assure you that our equipment is maintained to the highest standards. Sometimes these old wells simply develop pressure problems. It's an unfortunate but not uncommon occurrence in our industry." Ezra studied her carefully. Everything about her response was perfect, too perfect. She had an answer for every question, an explanation for every concern. But there was something in her eyes that suggested she was holding back information. The question was whether she was protecting someone else or simply lying. "Miss Castellanos," he said, stepping closer. "I'm Ezra McKinnon. I own the property adjacent to this one. I'd like to know what your company's plans are for this area." She turned her full attention to him, and he felt the weight of that intelligent gaze. "Mr. McKinnon. Yes, I've heard your name mentioned. You own some very valuable land." "Valuable to whom?" A slight smile played at the corners of her mouth. "To anyone interested in the future, Mr. McKinnon. Oklahoma is changing. The old ways of farming and ranching are giving way to progress. Oil is the future, and those who embrace that future will prosper. Those who don't." She gestured toward the smoking ruins of Pete Morrison's house. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Ezra felt his jaw tighten. "And if a man doesn't want to embrace your version of the future? Then I suppose he'll have to live with the consequences of his choice." Her voice was still pleasant, but there was steel underneath the silk. "Though I would hope that reasonable men might find ways to reach mutually beneficial arrangements." Before Ezra could respond, Victoria was already turning away. "Sheriff Bradley, please let me know if there's anything else my company can do to help with the investigation. And Mr. McKinnon." She paused and looked back at him over her shoulder. "Perhaps we'll have occasion to speak again soon." She climbed back into her carriage with fluid grace, and within moments they were disappearing down the road in a cloud of dust. But the scent of her perfume lingered in the air, mixing strangely with the smell of smoke and oil. "Well," said Sam Turner, breaking the silence that had settled over the crowd. "That was interesting." Ezra watched the carriage until it disappeared over the horizon. "That wasn't interesting, Sam. That was a declaration of war." The rest of the morning was spent helping to salvage what little remained of Pete Morrison's belongings and making arrangements for his temporary housing in town. But as Ezra worked, he couldn't shake the feeling that Victoria Castellanos hadn't come to the Morrison place out of concern for Pete's welfare. She had come to take measure of the local response to the explosion. She had come to see who might cause problems for her family's operations. And she had definitely come to get a look at him. By noon, most of the crowd had dispersed, and Ezra found himself alone with Sheriff Bradley among the ruins. The lawman was examining the ground around the derrick with the methodical attention of someone who had investigated more than his share of suspicious incidents. "Tom," Ezra said quietly, "what do you really think happened here?" Bradley straightened up and wiped the sweat from his forehead. "Officially? Equipment malfunction. Unofficially?" He glanced around to make sure they were truly alone. "Pete Morrison came to see me 3 days ago. Said he'd been getting visits from some of Castellanos' men. They were pressuring him to sign over his mineral rights, making it clear that refusing wasn't really an option." "Did he tell them no?" "He told them to go to hell." Bradley's expression was grim. "Pete Morrison fought in the war, Ezra. He's not the kind of man who backs down from a fight. But these oil people, they don't fight fair." Ezra nodded slowly. He'd suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made the situation feel more dangerous. "What are you going to do about it?" "What can I do? I've got no proof that anyone from Castellanos Oil was involved in this explosion. Even if I did, they've got more lawyers than I've got bullets. And the territorial governor is already talking about how important the oil industry is for Oklahoma's future statehood. So they can just destroy people's lives and get away with it? Bradley was quiet for a long moment, staring at the blackened earth. Not if someone stops them. But it would have to be someone with the resources to fight back, someone they couldn't easily intimidate or buy off. The implication hung in the air between them. Ezra owned the largest remaining independent ranch in the area, and his land showed clear signs of oil deposits. That made him either a valuable ally or a dangerous enemy to the Castellanos' operation. "They'll come for you next," Bradley said finally. "Question is, what are you going to do when they do?" Ezra didn't have an answer for that yet. But as he rode home across the blackened Oklahoma plains, with the smell of Pete Morrison's destroyed life still clinging to his clothes, he knew that his peaceful existence as a bachelor farmer was about to come to an end. The oil barons had come to his territory, and they weren't planning to leave anyone alone. What he didn't know was that Victoria Castellanos was already planning her approach, and that her next visit would force him to make a choice that would define not only his own future, but the future of everyone in Broken Creek County. The sun was setting by the time Ezra reached his own property, painting the sky the color of fresh blood. As he unsaddled his horse, he noticed fresh wagon tracks leading up to his house. Someone had been here while he was gone, and they had been bold enough to approach his front door in broad daylight. On his porch, weighted down with a stone, he found an envelope made of expensive paper. His name was written across it in elegant feminine handwriting that he recognized from the brief glimpse he'd had of Victoria Castellanos' gloved hands. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a formal business card. The card identified Victoria as Senior Acquisition Specialist for Castellanos Oil Company. The letter was brief and to the point. "Mr. McKinnon, I would very much like to discuss a business proposition with you. I will call on you tomorrow evening at sunset. I trust you will find my offer worth your consideration. V. Castellanos." Ezra stared at the letter for a long time as darkness settled over his ranch. Tomorrow evening, the oil Apache's daughter would come calling, and he had no doubt that she would arrive with promises of wealth beyond his imagining. The question was what price she would expect him to pay for that wealth, and whether he was prepared to pay it. In the distance, the lights of new oil derricks twinkled like fallen stars across the landscape that had been his family's home for 30 years. Change was coming to Oklahoma whether he liked it or not. The only question was whether he would profit from that change or be destroyed by it. As he folded the letter and slipped it into his vest pocket, Ezra McKinnon made a decision that would echo through the next day's confrontation. Whatever Victoria Castellanos was prepared to offer him, he was going to listen. Not because he was interested in her money, but because he needed to understand exactly what kind of enemy he was facing. The oil wars had come to Broken Creek County, and tomorrow evening, the first real battle would begin on his front porch. Victoria Castellanos returned to Ezra's ranch exactly 1 week later, but this time she wasn't alone. 3 men in expensive suits flanked her buggy on horseback, their hands resting casually on their gun belts in a way that suggested they knew how to use them. "Mr. McKinnon," she called out as she approached his porch, "I believe we have unfinished business." Ezra emerged from his house with his rifle in hand, not pointing it at anyone but making sure it was visible. "Far as I recall, our business was finished the moment I declined your generous offer." Victoria stepped down from her buggy with the same fluid grace he remembered, but something had changed in her demeanor. The polite veneer was gone, replaced by something harder and more dangerous. "My father was most disappointed to learn of your decision," she said, walking closer to the porch. "He sent me back to make you a final offer." "I'm listening." She reached into her coat and withdrew not an envelope of money this time, but a folded document. "This is a deed transfer for your property, Mr. McKinnon. Already drawn up, already notarized. All you need to do is sign it." Ezra glanced at the 3 armed men, who had positioned themselves strategically around his yard. "And if I refuse?" Victoria's smile was cold as winter wind. "Then you'll discover what happened to the previous owner of this land." "The previous owner was my father. He died of pneumonia." "No, Mr. McKinnon. The previous owner was a Comanche chief named Running Bear. He refused to sell this land to the railroad 20 years ago. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. They found pieces of him scattered across 3 counties. Ezra felt something cold settle in his stomach. Are you threatening to kill me, Miss Castellanos? I'm informing you that this land has a history of changing hands violently when business arrangements cannot be reached peacefully. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind moving through the dry grass and the distant hammering of oil derricks. Then Ezra did something that surprised everyone present, including himself. He laughed. Miss Castellanos, he said, setting his rifle against the porch railing, you've just made the same mistake your father made 20 years ago. What mistake is that? You assumed that fear would make me reasonable. Ezra stepped down from his porch and walked directly toward her, ignoring the 3 gunmen entirely. But you see, I've been thinking about our last conversation, and I've come to a realization. Victoria's confidence wavered slightly as he approached. What realization? You didn't come here to buy my land or my silence. You came here to discover whether I was the kind of man who could be bought. And now you know. He stopped just close enough that she had to look up to meet his eyes. The question is, what are you going to do with that knowledge? Victoria stared at him for what felt like an eternity. Then, without warning, she tore the deed transfer in half and let the pieces fall to the dusty ground. Men, she said quietly, never taking her eyes off Ezra's face, we're leaving. As quickly as they had arrived, Victoria Castellanos and her gunmen were gone, disappearing over the horizon in a cloud of dust and unanswered questions. But Ezra knew this wasn't over. If anything, it was just beginning. Because the oil Apache's daughter had just learned something about him that would change everything, and he had learned something about her that made him wonder if the real war wasn't between him and her father's company, but between Victoria Castellanos and her own conscience. The mystery deepening around them would soon draw them both into events that neither could control, and toward a reckoning that would test everything they believed about power, money, and the price of a human soul.